Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler review for Babel or Babel by R.F. Kuang. And I'm going to break this review into several different parts. I'll have timestamps in the description bar if you'd like to skip ahead to any one particular part, but it is all going to be non-spoilery and I am going to kind of go from one into the next. I'm going to start with the synopsis and the world, then dive into the magic system and the themes of the story, followed by the pacing, as well as identifying some things that maybe could make this for you or not for you, as well as one little thing at the very end that stood out to me that I wanted to mention briefly, but it doesn't really fit into any one particular category. So that'll be at the very end. But regardless, starting with the synopsis, I think the full title for this book makes it pretty clear what the book is about. So if you haven't seen the full title, it says Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. That tells you a lot already. So more specifically, we follow a young boy named Robin Swift. In the year 1828, when Robin is a young boy, he is taken from his home and he is taken by a man named Professor Lovell to London. There he is given education and then is expected to use that education at Oxford when he is of age to become a translator. The world, as you might imagine then, is our own, and it takes place in the 1800s, so you are going to see this as very much a historical fiction. The fantastical elements come into play with the magic system, but even how R.F. Kuang has tied that into the story, I definitely think it almost felt as if it wasn't fiction. It almost felt like it could have existed. The fantastical elements are woven into the story in a way that I thought felt very organic. We'll get more into the magic here in a little bit, but truly the world, the setting, is our own. The only other real differences are a couple of things that R.F. Kuang tweaked to fit the story, to fit the narrative, and also to allow for this particular tower to exist at Oxford. So there are some minor details that are changed here and there, but overall it's our own world. A lot of the story is a school setting, and I think R.F. Kuang captures the rigor of school, the intensity of school, constant fatigue you feel. That said, as you might expect, there is a lot of emphasis on language, and we'll talk about that more in the themes. But I do want to applaud R.F. Kuang because she is somebody that has a vast amount of knowledge on this. If you don't know, I don't always bring in personal things about authors, but I almost wanted to do that in this review because it so informs the writing of this book, and there's just something I wanted to compliment about it. So if you don't know, she is a translator. She has a degree in Chinese studies from Cambridge, an MS in contemporary Chinese studies from Oxford, and is now pursuing a PhD in East Asian languages and literatures at Yale. So whenever somebody is that knowledgeable, so much more than the average person, very easily they can use that to write a story that feels somewhat pretentious, or it feels like it's not for everyone, it's for the elite, and it can have that feel to it. And I don't think R.F. Kuang did that in the slightest. In fact, I think she did something that I always love to see, which is taking something that you have so much more knowledge of and breaking it down in a way that not only makes you as the reader feel like you understand these things, but that you also are taking it in and you're understanding it to a more complex level while doing this within a fantasy story, while still having characters that are experiencing so many things that so many people can relate to. And I always applaud that, especially because it's so easy to want to essentially flex, to show off, to be like, look how smart I am. But they say that the way in which you learn something, retain something the best is your ability to teach it. And I think that it takes breaking down something into smaller bites that make it more accessible and digestible to the average person. I just think that that deserves credit because I think she did that really well in this book. On top of that, how R.F. Kuang ties that into the magic system I thought was really interesting. We've seen a lot of magic systems where certain words create certain spells or certain magical abilities, but I think R.F. Kuang took that to the next level. There's a couple of times I tabbed some specifics about how the magic system works. To put it vaguely, you have the ability to put certain words into silver that essentially give that silver commands and give the silver abilities that it otherwise doesn't have. But you have to have the right words, and you have to have a good amount of use of that language and an understanding of that language for the magic to work properly. A specific example of how the magic works, there's a part where they talk about the word idiot and how it is used in Greek. So it talks about the different definitions, the exact definitions within the different languages. It can mean fool, but it also carries the definition of one who is private, unengaged with worldly affairs. His idiocy is derived not from lack of natural faculties, but from ignorance and lack of education. So when they translate the Greek version and then just the word idiot in English, it has the effect of removing knowledge. This bar then can make you forget quite abruptly things you thought you'd learned. Very nice when you're trying to get enemy spies to forget what they've seen. So that's an example, a kind of practical example of how they use it. They also use silver to reinforce buildings. There's just all sorts of different uses with these. And the way in which it's kind of held in check is that the language, the translations, have to go together from one language to the next. And you also, like I said before, the user has to have the ability to speak those languages fluently. They have to be able to think in that language, to dream in that language. And not everybody has that. And so it's important that they have people from different parts of the world who come together who then have these fluent tongues, basically. And on top of that, you can imagine that while they're in Oxford, in order to have people who are fluent in these other languages, they have to have people likely who grew up around those languages, who use those languages, who understand the ways in which you have these sayings and the ways that certain words evolve over time. So there's not necessarily sometimes direct translations from one language to the next, or they mean slightly different things, or that word actually comes from this word, so it has this function. So you have to have people from different parts of the world, and that is where our four main characters kind of come into the picture, all of which have different languages that they are familiar with, and they have come from different places. As a result, some of these people do not look like a lot of the other people that you would expect to be at Oxford at this time, and they are extremely mistreated. They never really feel like they are accepted. They are used. They have value with what they can do, but they are not fitting in the way that everybody else seems to fit in by nature of what they look like and where they're from. This brings us then to the themes. Obviously, language is one of the biggest themes, but language and how it is used toward all the other themes, it all kind of is combined. So we have language, assimilation, communication, racism, colorism, sexism, colonialism and colonization, and then violence as a tool of revolution, a tool of progress, and then also a sense of belonging. And that can be both in somebody feeling like they don't belong, they crave this feeling of family, and then also the ways in which they are mistreated as a result of not being seen as somebody who should belong. I'll also add, and this is me wording it cheesy, it doesn't word it this way in the book, but you could also argue that there's a theme of money or profit being the root of all evil, and how human beings matter less than making money. But really, there's so many different things within this story that you could dive really deep into. It is not the easiest to read at times because there's a lot of racial slurs that are used. At times, certain individuals will say honestly really disgusting things like, oh, I know it's in your nature to be XYZ, this negative thing, as a result of being from this place, of having this blood. And it is sometimes not the easiest because it's not just fantasy, because these are things that people have experienced, that people still experience today. And so it, on one hand, can be hard to read, but on the other hand, there are a lot of moments that I think a lot of people are going to relate to and be like, that's exactly how I've felt at times. That's an experience I've had before. And you don't have to even necessarily always really imagine yourself in these characters' shoes. There's just certain things that even today, different time period for a lot of people, not from the same country or the same circumstances necessarily, but when I was talking about having that sense of belonging, even something as simple as, well, it's not simple, but I'll give a personal example. On my mom's side, my grandparents are from Cuba. And so they have always kind of, there's that, they miss their culture. They miss being surrounded by people who speak their language, who speak it fluently, have similar experiences to the ones that they have. But then in America, at times there is this idea of, well, aren't you grateful to be here? You should be grateful you're not there anymore. And you see those sorts of things used against our characters, those sorts of arguments. Whenever somebody is fighting for progress, there's this idea of how ungrateful are you? Why aren't you more grateful for all of these things you've been given? And so I think a lot of people have experienced those sorts of things and can very much relate to them. I will say the entirety of the book essentially is from one perspective. You have a few times, just a few throughout the book, where very briefly you will get somebody else's perspective. It is third person, but you very much feel connected to Robin for the entirety of the book. And as a result, I think a lot of the themes feel a little bit, I don't want to say one-sided. It's not that they're lacking in nuance entirely or anything like that, but with how many different things you could dive into with all of these different themes, to really only be attached to one character, it makes it so that you can't really get into all of these themes as broadly. So an example of how this could have been tweaked a little bit if you'd had other perspectives. And to be clear, I don't mean I want a perspective that's like all for treating people terribly or anything like that. I don't need that perspective, but there's a lot of conversations about how do you have this catalyst to make things better without the use of violence. Is that even possible? Do we have to use violence? And if we do use violence, we know that it is often the poor, the working class. It's going to be those people who are affected the most. So is it worth it? There's all these sorts of questions that come up. Our main character goes to Oxford. He has a stipend. He has food made for him. He doesn't have to do his own laundry. He doesn't have to clean his room. And that's true of his friends as well. They are used to academic life. And the book does have a passage where it talks about essentially if they were to leave that behind and try to get jobs, they don't even know how they would go about that. They don't know what they would do. They don't know how to do things for themselves in a lot of ways. So where I'm going with all of this is, because they are making decisions that could ultimately affect the poor, the working classes, I think that the book could have hit even harder if you had a perspective of somebody who is from a poorer class. If you're somebody who they don't really want to change things, maybe because they know that it will mean there's the potential for them to die, there's the potential for their family members to die. I think when you add in those perspectives, it makes those themes, it allows for us to see them from different angles, and it makes all the decisions that much harder. But you also end up seeing like, oh, do I think that this should happen? But this is our, quote, good guy over here, but if I was one of these people and I didn't have a say, and this person who doesn't know my life experiences is making these decisions that affect my life, I might view them as the villain. And so I think that if you'd had those perspectives, you would have gotten that a little bit more. That's not to say that there aren't still very difficult decisions or that our characters are completely oblivious to the effects of their actions or their potential actions. You still see that in the story. You still see them grappling with what they've done, what they're thinking about doing, whether they should do anything at all. It's not entirely black or white. The characters are not perfect heroes. There's definitely a sense of, are these characters really our good guys? Are they the good guys to everyone? If they were to be remembered in history, would they be remembered as heroes? And how does where they're from, what they look like, how does that also affect their legacy or the things that they do? How does that affect how everybody sees not just them in that moment and what they're doing now, but how they're going to view them in the future? Some of the grayness of the story is just built into the fact that our character is translating things that are then used for Britain to expand and to take advantage of other countries and other peoples. And so while our character is benefiting from this life at Oxford, and while his skills are seen as very important and therefore allow for a fairly comfortable life in a lot of ways, there are, of course, a lot of negatives that our characters have to deal with, but overall, he has a lot that he loves about what he does at Oxford. And so he then has to ask himself, well, am I doing something terrible here? Am I doing something bad by contributing to this colonization of other groups of people? And this is through the translation, the understanding of other cultures through their language, the use of the silver in the magic system. So our character has to ask himself these questions. But then he wonders, okay, well, if I work against this, am I actually going to contribute to the downfall of society? Who's going to be the one to pay? Am I even going to make a difference, or am I going to end up doing things that negatively impact the less fortunate, and then I don't even make a dent in this powerful machine that is Great Britain? So what do I do? You don't know what the right direction is, And you feel for him because he's already had to endure so many difficult things in his life. He continues to have to endure a lot of difficult things. And this gives him happiness and this gives him peace, this dedication to this task. And it's sort of like, does it have to be me? I've already been through so much. You feel for him in that way. I want to transition now into the pacing of the book and whether or not this is going to be the book for you. So something that might not make this for everyone is just how much time we spend with the characters and their lectures from their professors, or them translating and them trying to understand the differences between different words in different languages. And there were times where I did think maybe we got a few things that were somewhat redundant, that there would be certain lectures that felt similar to other ones the characters had been given before. And personally for me, I actually feel like one or two things could have happened. We could have trimmed some of those things out and then brought in a new perspective. Obviously, that's just a personal thing I would have really liked to have in this book. We could have done that, or we actually could have taken this one book and I think expanded it into a duology, maybe a trilogy, but I think we could have made this a duology. It is currently the first book in a series. There will be more, but this one book does cover a fairly large amount of time. And with the amount of different things that happen, I think R.F. Kuang could have really just settled in and shown us so many more events that contributed to understanding our characters, understanding their motivations, seeing their breaking points, really settling into how they feel after certain events. We could have done either of those things. The pacing actually reminded me a lot of The Poppy War, which was also written by R.F. Kuang. You might recall the way that we start with that character when they're younger, and you're seeing the negative ways in which they're treated within a more intimate, small setting. And then they go somewhere and they have the opportunity to learn, and you see a lot of the same beats and the same amount of time. Like sometimes a lot of time would pass, and then you sort of zero in and focus on specific events. And I ended up feeling like, okay, I know what beats we're gonna hit and when, but on top of that, I also felt like I knew the direction the character was going to go in, and I knew their arc. And there were a lot of parallels beyond just the beats of the story. I think the beats for our character, they were very similar. And so that's one thing where I was a little bummed by, because I wanted to always wonder what was going to happen. And for me, I was pretty sure I knew what was going to happen. And I found that my predictions ended up being accurate. That might not be the same for everybody. Even if you have read The Poppy War, maybe it won't matter. Obviously, if you haven't read The Poppy War, then it especially won't matter. But if you go back and want to read that one, you might notice some of the parallels. I don't want to go too in-depth with that. That's basically all I'm going to say, because I don't want to draw attention to those things and make it predictable for you if it wouldn't be otherwise. I also found that there was a character in the story that the use of language that R.F. Kuang had meant I knew kind of the direction that that other character's arc was going to go as well. And that brings me to another point that I wanted to tie in, which was the use of dialogue in this story. Despite how much research went into this book and how you can clearly see there was so much care into crafting this setting and this time and doing it with a lot of accuracy, the dialogue does feel a little modern. It didn't bother me necessarily. It's a work of fiction. I'm not typically bothered unless they're using like LOL or something. That would be really bizarre. I wouldn't like that. But they do talk not all that different from how we talk. That didn't bother me. However, there were certain words that I think are very used now. That there was one paragraph as an example, and this is tying back to what I was saying about the predictability of one of the characters' arcs. Within one paragraph, in reference to a certain character, the words performative and ally are used, not together, but they're used within the same paragraph. And when I saw those words, I'm like, I know exactly what's going to happen with this character. I hope I'm wrong, but I think I know. And then I did know, and that was, I almost have to think that that was intentional, because there's so much intentionality with language in this book. I feel like those words served a purpose. And I almost wonder if R.F. Kuang wanted to clue you in, if she wanted to have readers be like, I feel this. But it did make it so that I kind of could tell the direction that that character's arc was going to go. But because that's somewhat of a con, I want to jump into what was my absolute favorite thing about this book. It's very specific, and I can't go into a great amount of detail about it. But the name of our main character. So our main character gives himself the name Robin Swift. At the beginning of the book, the person that takes him in says, well, we're going to need something to call you by. And he goes to say his name, and the person says, nobody will ever be able to pronounce that. Which, already, you're like, oh, that's something a lot of people can relate to. So our character essentially gives himself a name. How R.F. Kuang handled that, what she did with that, I found really moving. It was my favorite thing about this book. I thought it was very well done. And I kept waiting. I kept wondering when we were going to get, I guess you could call a resolution to that point. And how she handled it, I thought it was somewhat, I don't want to say too much. I'll just say it was beautiful. But I don't want to describe the tone of the beauty because I don't want to ruin anything. I just really liked, if you read it, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I just think that it tied the entire book together. I know that this has been a very hyped book. So many people are picking this up. If you have picked it up yourself, I would love to know your thoughts. If you want to mention anything spoilery, just write spoilers and then enter a bunch of times so that anybody who glances at the comments isn't spoiled if they haven't read it yet. And then let me know, are you planning to pick this one up if you haven't read it yet? But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.